From Washington to Warsaw, Paris to Ankara, Brussels, Berlin, Bucharest, and Belgrade. Through pandemics and political movements, cooperation and confrontation, digital divides, and defending democracy. The German Marshall Fund is at the pulse of transatlantic relations today, convening the experts and insights needed to navigate tomorrow's world.
Good morning and good afternoon to all of you who have logged on to our fourth Transatlantic Tuesday of 2021. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion series that takes a look at topics that are pertinent to both sides of the Atlantic. And today we're going to discuss the topic of the Republican Party. What are the divisions within the Republican Party? Where's their unity? Where's the Republican Party? How is it moving forward? And the future of the Republican Party, and of course, ramifications for US foreign policy. We're really glad to have GMF board member, the Honorable Will Hurd, with us here today. But before I hand over to my colleague, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, who will introduce Congressman Hurd, I'd like to just go over a few sort of state of play of how we're going to run today's discussion. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The questions will automatically queue up, and after about a 20-minute to 25-minute conversation between Thomas and Congressman Hurd, Thomas will probably open up to questions. And also, please, if you'd like to introduce yourself, you can put your name down in the Q&A box, and Thomas will also mention that. Before I hand over to Thomas, I'd like to also thank our Business Alliance members for making this discussion series possible. Bayer, Google, Pfizer, and Deloitte are some of the companies that make up our Business Alliance Council. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next month. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Thomas. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Suda. And welcome, Congressman Hurd. Welcome to Texas from Berlin. You can bet there is a lot of interest over here in the Republican Party, also post-election. And that's what we want to pick up in there is you are a very good person to do that, having been a three-term congressman, left Congress just, shall I say weeks, or is it months now ago?
Let's go with months.
Right. And you're a free man, and will speak your mind on the state of the Republican Party. By way of introduction, I want to say that it is notable that your now former district has a 550-mile border with with Mexico. So it's a border district that also speaks to your interests, your experience with border issues, with immigration. You've worked on technology and cybersecurity in the U.S. Congress, a noted expert in this field. We should also mention that you have been one of the notable moderates in the Republican caucus that has also created some, of course, political controversy and friction with you, also with President Trump at times. And there's two more things I should mention about you. You are a member of the Transatlantic Task Force of the German Marshall Fund and the Chancellor Schmidt Foundation in Hamburg that has worked over the months before Joe Biden came into office to think about how transatlantic relations should evolve. And you're a member of the board of the German Marshall Fund, which is where we oftentimes meet. So welcome again, and let's start right into it. And so, simple question, is the Trump era over, or are we just sort of in a detox phase and are gearing up for some version of Trumpism without Trump?
So I'm going to say it depends, right? Is the first answer, but to unpack that what does it depend on? When you look at what's going to happen in the next election in 2022, it is a high likelihood, it's almost a guarantee that Republicans are going to take back the House. If you look at, we're going through redistricting every 10 years, the United States does a census. The census determines how many states get congressional seats. When you look at the places that are going to lose seats and the places that are going to pick up seats, that delta automatically says it likely leans to a Republicans taking back the House. And then when you look at the number of seats that Joe Biden lost, and there is a Democrat in, I want to say it's about 25 seats. The margin is in single digits that we have to pick up. And so the likelihood that Republicans win. Now, how we win is going to determine the answer to your question. Are we going to see some QAnon nuts get elected in primaries and ultimately, and when I say QAnon, I'm talking about the conspiracy theory that former Democrats were eating babies, which is crazy. Or is it going to be done with Republicans that have, conservative Republicans based on values in a different molds? That's going to be the decision. When you look at some of the Senate seats, some are already predicting that in Alabama, a gentleman named Mo Brooks is going to win, and he's now a member of Congress. Congressman Brooks is already being endorsed by Donald Trump. So how long President Trump's and that influence stays on the party is going to depend on what happens in these upcoming elections. Some would say that right now the Republican Party is broken up into kind of, let's call it 5 categories. These are diehard, supporters of Donald Trump. You have people that like Donald Trump but don't think he should have a role in the party. You have people that are never Trumpers. Then you have some of this extreme fringe that will always support Donald Trump but believe in conspiracy theories. And the 5th is kind of a mix on he's okay, maybe he should have a role, maybe he doesn't have a role. But ultimately, I think the electoral success of the Republican Party is going to depend on the Republican Party making sure it looks like America. We have lost 7 out of 8 of the last national elections, right? We have a real opportunity. The fact that Donald Trump lost by 7 million plus votes and Democrats were unable to pick up seats in the House, and I would say winning the seats in Georgia was because of the Herculean efforts of Stacey Abrams. The opportunity for Republicans to pick up independents and conservative Democrats outweigh the efforts that some are pursuing in talking to the more extreme of the party.
What I found interesting about your answer is that you said the reverse from what you could have expected, that the outcome of the election would depend on whether or not Donald Trump is part of the mix or isn't. But you said the other way around. His influence will be dependent on the nearly inevitable and how the nearly inevitable win in 2022. That's for Germans probably an inverse logic.
Well, so here's why I say it this way: the fights, the future of the Republican Party, the soul of the Republican Party, is going to be decided in Republican primaries within the next 12 months, and that is and whoever wins those primaries is going to dictate who wins in the general elections. And let me give a little math. It's morning here, it's afternoon there. 92% of the seats in 2020 had been decided in a primary, meaning that these are not competitive seats. These are seats that really there's one party rule. There were only about 34 seats where you had people vote in the last presidential election for president, one party for president, one party for their member of Congress. So those handful of seats is really what's going to decide this national narrative. Now, the Department of Commerce, who does the census, is behind, and we're probably not going to see the results of the census. I think it was delayed 3 or 4 months. So we may not see, like, the first primaries in the United States were supposed to begin in March of 2022. So we're less than a year away. Now those dates may push because of this problem. So this debate is going to happen, not in November, but this will be decided in the next 12 to 13 months.
Now, what makes life for moderates like yourself, or like former Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, or other moderates, Adam Kinzinger, who now tries to organize an effort by more moderate members of the Republican Party? What makes it so hard these days? And what to make of that Kinzinger and others' efforts to organize the middle, the moderates?
Yeah, and so that phrase, I accept that phrase. However, it's a word that I actually don't like. I don't like it because moderate has a connotation of kind of middle of the road, and it's almost used here in the U.S. as, diversively, right? But to me, the moderates, folks like Kinzinger and myself, we are actually ideologically consistent. We're the ones that it doesn't matter who is president, right? Or who is Speaker of the House, whether it's someone from our party or not, we're the ones that are consistent. Oh, and by the way, we're the ones that have to actually go out and change hearts and minds, right? In my old district, if every Republican voted for me, I would still lose, because you had to get independents, you had to get Democrats to vote for you. So it's very easy. I'm sure this phrase translates across the Atlantic, but it's easy to preach to the choir, right?
Okay.
When
I'll call you guys the consistents. Is that better? Well,
you know what? I kind of like that. I kind of like that. And so, but what happens is, because of this whole issue I just explained about the 92% being decided in the primary, most elected officials only speak to a handful, which is ultimately a minority in the district, because they are the more reliable voters within a primary, right? And so again, another math, but I get into math because it's important to know. In 2018, this is 2 cycles ago, the average primary, the number of people that voted in a primary was about 42,000 people, right? That's Republican and Democrat. In a general election, let's call it 325,000. So in 92% of congressional seats, that means 21,000 people plus one are deciding the outcome. And that means most elected officials are only talking to that group of people, which is ultimately a minority within the district, right? But it has outsized influence in that primary. So moderates, to survive primaries, need to get those conservative voters that only vote in general elections but don't vote in primaries to vote in primaries. And guess what? It takes work. It's hard, and it takes effort. And so that is, but it's doable, and that's how I've been able to win in my primaries.
Now, how likely? And here's the first question from the audience, from Stefan Liebig, who is a member of the Bundestag. How likely is a split of the party?
A split. So. What is the Republican Party? Let's start. I'm going to start by answering that question. Historically, the Republican Party has been, and let's call it in the last 25 plus years. Let's say 25 years. Social conservatives, fiscal conservatives, and defense hawks, or what I like to call national security hawks. What does a fiscal conservative mean? If you go back to the early 2000s, or let's say the late 90s, a fiscal conservative could have been a deficit hawk, which is someone who believed in reducing the deficit to include increasing taxes, and supply siders who were saying that the most important thing is to cut taxes. Like that's a divergence of ideology, but sometimes we accept that, oh, fiscal conservative mean the same thing. No, within that group, it's different. If you talk about if you talk about social conservatives, in the 2000s, you had kind of the Pat Robertson Republican. This was a guy who was a tele-evangelical person on television, where the only issues were really around abortion and things like that. But you also had back in the 2000s what one pollster calls the Dennis Miller Republicans. This was the old. He was on the Saturday Night Live, which was a long-running skit comedy, and then he was a talk show host. And these were folks that, when it comes to abortion and gay marriage, they had mixed, different opinions, but they were more focused on things like illegal immigration and people gaming the system, free riders, right? And then, go ahead.
So I guess what you're saying is don't underestimate the size of the big tent that is the GOP.
It's true, and so a split, a bifurcation, that split has kind of always been there, right? You can go back to Joseph McCarthy and Dwight Eisenhower, right? These are same party, right? So there's always going to be that tension within the party. Which party has a greater influence in the direction of the party, right? And ultimately, are we going to be able? And I think the key is, how do we recapture the presidency? And the way you recapture the presidency, we know the demographic trends that are changing. 2050, America is going to be a majority minority country. And so when you look at the largest three growing groups of voters, people from communities of color, women with a college degree in the suburbs, and people under the age of 29, the Republican brand within those groups is pretty bad. And you saw President Trump's numbers slip with that. So the fact that President Trump lost and Republicans across the country overperformed him, and when you have guys like there's a gentleman in Pennsylvania who would be considered moderate, he's always in a tough race, outperformed Donald Trump by 35,000 votes. That's crazy number. And so we should be looking at the opportunity, right? And it's going to be harder. So is there going to be a split? I don't think there's going to be a split, but there's going to continue to be frictions. And look at, John Boehner has a book coming out, and he talks about his problems he had with folks within his own party.
Right. Now, from looking from over here, and thereby an Atlantic away, one wonders why there has been so little reckoning within the Republican Party after the January 6th. You initially had a sense that there would that set off a wave of something. But then that seemed to fizzle out and actually turn around. Liz Cheney had to face rallies in Wyoming for what she did. So help us understand what's going on in the party in terms of the post-January 6th environment.
Well, that feeling fizzled out that night on January 6th, when I think it was 141 Republicans voted against certifying the election, which to me is pretty outrageous. And this is me making an assumption, but I'm pretty confident that more than 100 of those folks thought that election was okay, that they were afraid of facing some primary voters who may say you weren't loyal enough to President Trump. The Republican Party has to do three things if we're ever going to get back to winning national elections. We have to accept that the 2020 election was not stolen. It was lost. It was lost because Donald Trump was unable to make the Republican Party look like the rest, look like America. Number two, we have to disabuse ourselves and distance ourselves from conspiracy theorists and not perpetuate conspiracy theories And three, we have to be a party that's based on our values, right? And what do I mean by that? If we are the party that believes in local control and federalism and not concentrating power within the center government, then why are state governments, Republican state governments around the country trying to tell the local precincts how they can vote and what hours of operations can happen in a vote, right? These are some of the instead of doing something that's politically expedient, do it based on your value. If we're able to do that, we're going to be successful, because again, it's not like the Democratic Party. The fact that you saw in the last election, Latino voters along the border in Texas, increase our vote count toward Republicans. There are some far left opinions that are out of touch with the middle or the median American, and so we have an opportunity to go after that kind of vote. But why did people change on the January 6th? They're making a calculation that they're worried about a primary vote.
Let me pick up on that and thereby sort of use and take in a slightly different direction a question that we've been getting in from Raymond Termini. Is Joe Biden helping to unite the Republican Party?
Is Joe Biden helping to unite the Republican Party?
Well, and by that I mean the liberalism that is being critiqued by some Republicans that speaks from the first.
I think there's a unification of rhetoric, but let's look at the latest COVID package that was passed without Republican support in Congress. It had overwhelmingly a majority of Americans supported it, right? And so did that position unify Republicans in opposition, elected Republicans in opposition of President Biden? Yes, but when you look at the analysis on the ground and what voters thought of it, it was something different. I think something similar can be said of voting rights. Here in my state of Texas, the Texas legislature is going to be looking at legislation, but there was some polling done by Republican polling firms that showed a supermajority, an overwhelming number of Republican primary voters believed in increasing access to the vote, not decreasing it. And so unfortunately, I think that there are some Republicans in elected positions that are doing things that are not necessarily welcomed by a majority of voters.
Now, you mentioned it, I think, twice already, that the Republican Party within the last 8 election cycle has won the popular vote only once. And that in order to change that, the Republican Party has to be in step with how America looks and thinks. Mm-hmm. Hasn't Donald Trump done part of that? He has increased the vote share of Latinos, of some the Black vote share slightly, but certainly the working class has flocked to the Republican Party twice. So at the end of Trump's term, doesn't the Republican Party look more like America than it used to before Donald Trump?
No, because I would say that if you're saying that, I think the Black vote, there was a question about whether it went from what was it, 20? I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but the numbers were super low, right?
They were low.
They were low. Yeah. So you're saying
a facetious argument, Will. You did that, of course.
Yeah. You're like, it's like going from 21 to 23. Is that something we should really beat our chest about? Absolutely not, right? You did see some margins within. Let's take Texas and Latinos in Texas. What drove Latinos in Texas were 2 issues: defund the police. And when Democrats were advocating for defund the police, it really is defund law enforcement. And when you look along the border, it's like 40% of Latinos along the border are involved or have a family member in some form or fashion involved in law enforcement. Okay, guess what? You're advocating a position that's going to impact my ability to take care of my family. And then when you talk about the attack on the oil and natural gas industry, when you look at the Eagle Ford Shale and the Permian Basin, South Texas and West Texas, where the energy activity in the United States was really driven from these two areas. When you talk about even getting rid of natural gas, that's another issue that has an impact on individual voters. So I would say that those two issues had a greater impact, right, than what we saw. And guess what? The numbers when it comes to blue collar voters, Joe Biden won those people back. That's why he won in some of the states that he won, that President Trump ultimately beat Hillary Clinton in. I ultimately think one of the things this shows is that how bad of a candidate Hillary Clinton was in 2016, and an inability for the Clinton organization to connect with some of those voters.
So then let's turn the question around. Then what does the Republican Party need to do to reconnect in order to win majorities in places that it hasn't been able to?
So this formula is not new, right? The Republican Party is supposed to be based on freedom. Freedom leads to opportunity. Opportunity leads to growth. Growth leads to progress. I think one area that we should be stressing even more is education. And when you look at the opportunities and some of the way to reform public schools in the United States, some of these initiatives that have been done by Republican governors have shown a significant increase in outcomes for Latino and Black students, especially here in my home state of Texas. I think education and reforms education is a winning issue. When you talk about how the Republican Party, yes, everybody knows we're the party of Lincoln. Everybody knows that. But we got to get back to, we should be representing everybody, and we should be making it easier for people to vote, right? We should be able, there's this notion among some that if you have more people voting, they're not going to vote for you. Guess what? Then you need to change your strategy and appeal to those folks. Show up to places that we haven't been before and take a message about equality of opportunity. And so when you engage in communities and show up, many of those communities, the reason I was able to win, a Black Republican can win in a 71% Latino district, because I showed up, listened to folks, and talked about conservative values, and it resonated with them. And then I delivered results, right? And so it's not hard, but it starts, and it also starts with our rhetoric. And part of my language, but if you're seen as an asshole, a racist, a misogynist, a homophobe, an Islamophobe, when you're seen that way, it's going to prevent people from listening to you, even if you have better ideas. So we have to expunge this, the white nationalist kind of flavor that permeates and has permeated on and off in American politics since the beginning. So those are some of the things that we should be doing, and we should also be talking about the role. Like what frustrates me within this broader conversation is we shouldn't be having debates on whether or not to wear a mask or whether or not you should get a vaccine. You should wear a mask, you should socially distance, and you should get a vaccine, right? Period, in the story. Because we are currently involved in a new Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party, right? The Chinese government has made it very clear they're trying to surpass the United States as the sole hegemon in the world. And it's not just the US, it's the US and our allies. That's why it should matter to our transatlantic partnership. So we have serious issues, and they're trying to do this within the context of global leadership and advanced technology. And so if we're not prepared, if we're not talking about how can the public and the private sector work together, how can we work with our allies when it comes to protecting information and making sure we have the best data to train algorithms that is based on protecting civil liberties, not taking advantage of civil liberties, then we're going to lose our position in the rest of the world. And I always use the example back in 475 AD, a Roman, hanging out in Rome, never thought the next year the Western Roman Empire would fall. They probably didn't even know what a Goth was, but it happened. And so if we're talking about those real issues that we're dealing with, that's how we can ultimately win.
Okay. But what about the white working class? We mentioned them. Inroads, then lost again, you mentioned it.
Yeah.
What about the future of that segment of the electorate that clearly, when the Democratic Party turns into a more urban liberal party, isn't being addressed by the Democratic Party? So there's an opening here that populism tried to fill. So is there space for populism in order to get to the white working class?
Well, so I don't think attracting or being competitive amongst the white working class and populism have to be one and the same. It's putting together programs. Look, I don't care. You want to be able to put food on your table, a roof over your head, and take care of the people that you love, right? Make sure that they're healthy and happy. And so if you talk about, equality of opportunities, right? That you're going to be able to make your own decisions that are for your family, not a handful of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. or the state capitals. That's a way to be attractive, not only to the white working class in the cities, but to rural folks as well. I represent a significantly rural part of the country, as well as the seventh largest city in the United States as well. And so those things are not mutually exclusive, but it's making sure that folks understand that those are the values that we're based off of.
I have a question here that I want to, from Johannes Ahlefeld, who also works in the German Bundestag. Who's behind the 3-digit number of initiatives at state level trying to limit voter participation and voter mobilization? Is it a coordinated attack or driven by local instincts of political survival?
So I don't think it's coordinated. I think it's the latter part. It is, there are still voters that believe the 2020 election was stolen. That's absolutely wrong. The 2020 election was the most secure election in the United States history. The number of folks that tallied and looked at the election confirms that it was the most secure election. And so this narrative that there are folks that believe that somehow fraud was rampant within the election. It is attempts to try to appeal to that voter and show, hey, we're working on something. And so because you had that feeling and that sentiment in multiple communities across probably all the states, that's why you're seeing some of this effort happening.
You mentioned a future agenda that the Republican Party should embrace, and started to mention education. You talked about the 3 pillars of the Republican Party: the traditional, the social conservatives, the fiscal conservatives, the foreign policy hawks. Now, some of these categories have been fuzzy over time. Fiscal prudence, where'd that go? Is it coming back? Should it be coming back? Social conservatism, changes in the acceptance of gay marriage, even in the conservative base over time. But then again, we have the COVID culture wars that sort of open a new front in these culture wars. So could you expand a little bit on these shifts in that also are driven by trade-related issues? The party of free trade was a party of free trade no longer. So one is a little bit confused about the ideological divisions within or directions the GOP has been taking. Is that being clarified now in the process of a post-Trump world?
Is it being clarified? No, right? Have those divisions always been there? Yes. Are they more pronounced? Absolutely. I would say that Donald Trump's foreign policy, especially on the economic side, was probably more in line with a traditional Democratic foreign policy than not. And so look, I think we should be strengthening our partnerships, not weakening them. If we see what the Chinese government has been doing in rules setting entities and organizations, they're trying to influence it towards to stack the deck in their way. When the debate around foreign aid, the debate about where should we have troops, the debate around, NATO is one of the most successful alliances in the history of the world. 70 years of peace and prosperity in Europe. That has, led to the U.S. and Europe having, half of the world's GDP. These are all positive things. We have forgotten them, and we have to make a case, because this is the only way that we're going to be able to continue to play a role within the rest of the world. And I'll be honest, I want the American economy to stay the most important and strongest economy in the country. I think that in the world, and that benefits us, that benefits our allies. And so, right now you talk about the border and illegal immigration. The reason we have illegal immigration in the United States is because of lack of economic opportunity, extreme poverty, and violence in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And so why do we not have a Marshall Plan for that region where we can solve the problem before it gets to our borders? That is how we're going to use foreign aid. And it's a fraction of the cost to use foreign aid to solve those root causes than to deal with the issue when it finally comes to our border. And so I think that's a current example that shows how we have to have and be engaged in the rest of the world. WHO, every country, when I was still in Congress, I sent a letter to all the countries that had an ambassador in Washington, D.C., ask about some of their concerns around the WHO and the lack of response we were seeing from the Chinese government. Most countries expressed a concern. You don't pick up your ball and run away and leave the WHO. You stay and you work with your allies to fix the organization and make sure the organization is doing the things that it's supposed to be doing. That is the role that, where I think foreign policy should be, and I think Republicans should be leading that.
Now, you've already swiftly moved us into the foreign policy realm, because looking from Europe, what a foreign policy Republican style would look like in future is of prime importance. And in fact, we have a question here of Cristina Gonzalez of Politico Europe, who does ask this very question: how does a forward-looking conservative foreign policy look like, and in what ways does it differ from the Democrats?
Well, so I think a forward U.S. policy, or a Republican policy on foreign policy. I think an individual like a Mike McCall, who is the ranking Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I think he is a good example and smart, one of the more talented leaders when it comes to foreign policy and expressing conservative views. I think you can take something like the Iran deal. The question around and the arguments around Iran and a deal was not trying to find a deal. It is making sure the Iranians do some very simple things. Stop killing American forces and our allied forces in other parts of the world as a state sponsors terror. Stop putting stop killing your own people when they protest, right? Stop lying about your nuclear weapon developments, right? If you want nuclear power, we can work out a deal with that. And so it is a Republican a perspective on this is you have to address all of those, not just the how much of fissile material can be produced. So that's very narrow. I would say that a Republican foreign policy also includes more support of free trade than what you're probably going to see out of a Joe Biden administration, which is probably going to look more like what Donald Trump did, which in my opinion was not conservative policy. Using tariffs against our European friends, against some of our allies, actually hurt American industry. The American agriculture sector was significantly impacted by this, to include having to put a number of programs in place to help the American farmer. Oh, and by the way, those international supply chains moved and changed.
Now,
and they're not changing back.
Congressman, listening to you, it seems a little bit like there's this strange alliance between the Joe Biden Democrats and Donald Trump, and sort of a true and blue conservative spirit here. But isn't it also true that outside of Donald Trump's preferred mode of unilateral foreign policy, the Republican Party has become less internationalist than it used to be? And you've already mentioned one element of it, which is NATO. It's not an unmitigated love affair anymore, and the utility of alliances has been put into questions by some members. So where do you see that corridor? How do you?
Yeah. So have there, when the titular head of your party espouses something, yes, that has a disproportional influence on the party. But if you look at the votes in Congress in supporting a military budget that was positive to our friends, in supporting NATO, the number of votes that we had in support of NATO in Congress when I was there were pretty significant, and they were overwhelmingly supported by the majority of the Republican Party. That is not always articulated. You have some of the more well-known folks that get a lot of coverage that articulate a particular position, but when you actually look on the votes that happen on the floor, you see a different perspective, right? And so I'm not trying to minimize that, but I'm just saying that there's plenty of Republicans out there, folks that nobody on this call probably knows their name, because these are not the high-profile Republicans that have large Twitter followings, but these are the folks that are voting for things. Let's look at something like a TPP. TPP was going to be delivered in a Republican House, right, with a Republican speaker for President Obama, right? And because President Obama couldn't pull enough of his own Democrats, Republicans were going to have to deliver this. Now, this became an issue in the 2016 election, and everything fell apart from that. But so when you look at people's votes and the vote margins of some of the legislation that shows a pro-transatlantic relationship, you'll see the majority of Republicans are in support of it.
Why is there's intervention fatigue everywhere in the West after 20-some years of different, sometimes failed, sometimes so successful attempts at intervention? But there is also intervention critique in the Republican Party. When you compare that to the times of John McCain, that's a different sound that we're hearing from the Republican Party. Help us understand.
Fatigue and critique are two different things. If federal dollars and blood, sweat, and tears of our citizens are being expended, we should make sure that we're achieving our values and our goals, right? And so, if you look at a place like Afghanistan, where I served and spent time, our footprint in Afghanistan is significantly smaller than it was in 2008, 2009, when Obama ordered the surge. When you look at how much federal dollars is going to that, I think folks still believe that they look at the price tag for the entirety of the endeavor. But guess what? We still have troops in South Korea. We still have troops in Germany. We still have troops in Japan. Nobody's questioning whether or not that's not of value. And so I think the effort is: are we seeing a return on those initiatives? And which means we have to have very clear what are our foreign policy goals in those areas. How do they fit into our national interests? And how are we going to evaluate whether something is being successful? I will always go to Afghanistan. I think 4 million plus girls and women have been in school. That is what's going to ultimately change the future of that country. And so you know, critique is one thing, right? But which it should be acceptable, because we should be making sure that we're maximizing the largesse of the American people.
Congressman, when I look at the watch here, we're out of time, and I can't believe we are. That speaks to the way you've conducted the session here, that you've had us glued to, and certainly had me glued to the screen. I think we're hearing a tone of Republican thinking that we used to be accustomed to, haven't been for some time. I imagine that there is several listeners out there who will happily reconnect with this tone and this outlook. I understand that I neglected some of the, no, not neglected, but didn't get to some of the question. I did weave in multiple of them, but like the one Ruprecht Brandis has been answered without having picked it up. The same with a couple of Johanna Ahlefeld's questions or David Muller's questions. So I think we did get to a larger number of our nearly 20 questions that we had, although I apologize to all those who I didn't get to. Congressman,
that just means I'm going to come back. That just means I'll have to come back sometime.
That's a promise. I take that as a promise, not as a self-invitation. As a board member of GMF, we always like to have, and by the way, we'd like to have you here in person with a shot in the arm, and all of us having some shots in the arm.
That would be amazing, and something I'm looking forward to. So I appreciate y'all's time.
We'll
appreciate y'all's time.
Thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon, a good evening.